It was the best of times. It was the worst of times. It was the age of wisdom. It was the age of foolishness. It was the epoch of belief. It was the epoch of incredulity. It was the season of light. It was the season of darkness. It was the spring of hope. It was the winter of despair. We had everything before us. We had nothing before us. We were all going direct to heaven. We were all going direct the other way. So Charles Dickens, who knew a lot about books, prophesied with great precision the situation of the book in the 21st century. It's astonishing how well he did it. And what I want to make clear tonight is that I'm with him 100%. I think that his description of the situation and future of the book is exactly accurate. We're all going direct to heaven, and we're all going direct to the other place. Now, when I'm asked to talk about the future of the book, some people expect me to play this character, because I have to admit, a member of a species that has gradually become almost extinct, the species known as the book bum. Once we ranged the cities in herds, smelling out bargains in dusty secondhand bookstores, rummaging through barrows. Now the few of us who remain sit morosely at home, occasionally venturing out to sneer at the paperbacks that might be available in a charity shop. I grew up in a Manhattan of ancient secondhand bookshops, run by mad polymaths who could be cajoled to lower their already low prices. By the time I had entered high school, my friends were being thrown, well, I won't say where they were being thrown out of, but you'll be able to guess. They were being thrown out of places they shouldn't be because their fake IDs were insufficient. I, however, was being thrown out of the New York Public Library because my ID was not sufficient. In college and in graduate school at the University of Chicago, I had the chance to work in wonderful collections. And after that, research took me from one great library to another, to the British Library with the magnificent dome of its one-time reading room and its even more magnificent inmates staggering under the weight of their erudition, to the University of Leiden Library in the Netherlands on the Roppenburg, that beautiful canal, where a librarian said, "What have you come to work on?" And I said, "I've come to work on Joseph Scaliger." And she broke into a big smile and said, "You've come to the right place," something that's never happened to me at any other library. To the mother of all libraries, the Vatican, where Father Leonard Boyle, the wonderful Dominican librarian, would take you down to the stacks in those innocent days. They don't do this anymore. The stacks in the Vatican are like a bank vault. There's a bulkhead door with a round wheel that opens it like the wheel in a submarine door. And he would wheel the wheel and open the door and then say, "Stand back, my boy, and let the bad air out." And this incredible miasma would emerge from the stacks. The Vatican possesses 150,000 manuscripts, many of them written on the skin of animals, all of them bound in the skin of animals around wood. At night, he says, the animals come back. It took a great sacrifice of blood and horror to make all the beauty of those books. And to smell it was to get a sense of their materiality, a phrase we often use about books these days, in a really literal sense. I fell in love, as others have before me, and I'm happy to see in the audience Owen Gingerich, one of the world's great habitués of libraries. I fell in love with it all, the quirky, incomplete catalogs that leave out the most important things unless you think of asking the librarian, the obdurately obstructive librarians, the grumpy but knowledgeable booksellers, and above all, the books and manuscripts. For when you work this way, you come to know not texts, not some immaterial collection of signs that exist out of time and space, but books. Books which are almost living things, books which have belonged to people. Here, my favorite long-lost bookshop, Thornton's of Oxford. It looks innocent enough, just a window that says books for cash. But Thornton's was famous for the back room in which they sold off the libraries of dead Oxford dons. It was rumored that more than one Oxford scholar had dropped dead in terror when he saw the manager of Thornton's walking towards his house. Books are deeply human. They're marked by their owners, marked by their lives. They bear scars on their bindings. They're eaten by small creatures and devoured by the acid in their paper. They're as ivy curls up old stone buildings, marginal notes curl up the sides of pages from the era when everyone read pen in hand, when reading and writing were almost the same act. Much though I love digital books and other media, and I do, I don't know how they can ever give one quite that experience. Look, for example, at the manicule, the little pointing hand. In the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, the manicule marked the spot that had interested a reader. You scattered them through a book like Hansel and Gretel, scattering their candies on the way to the witch's shack to mark their path. Nowadays, a manicule is just the finger of a Google scanner, which happens to be misplaced, and you're happy if it's not an uglier body part. As a book bum and a member of this dying species, I often find myself wondering about my brilliant, erudite, energetic students and how they will look back on the years that they're now spending ruthlessly seeking out, downloading, and organizing PDFs. Their adventures are more international than mine ever were. They're bringing documents from all over the world, from Asia and Africa, as well as Europe and America, and yet it's all done with no smell, with no touch, with no taste. Will they, 30 years from now, stand before an audience and say, "I am of that dying breed, a PDF bum"? I'm not certain. So that's one reason you might expect me to say bah humbug when I look at the digital world. The second reason is that the people I work on were also fanatics of the book. Let me introduce you to the man with whom I've spent a lot of time in the last 5 years, Isaac Casaubon, French Reformed scholar, the greatest Greek scholar in Europe in the years around 1600, when books in Greek and Latin were still thought to hold the secrets, not just to philosophy, but to practical life. When Maurice of Nassau read Polybius's account of the Roman army, reorganized his Dutch soldiers, and fought the Spanish to a standstill by introducing Roman discipline. Casaubon read so passionately that his printed books became manuscripts. These are printed books, but the one on the left, his copy of the historian Polybius, is so thick with his notes that the Bodleian has called it a manuscript, more manuscript than printed book. This is powerful reading. Casaubon read so passionately that reading was a kind of ascetic religious exercise for him. He tells us that before he would read every day, he would comb his hair in order to be presentable to the great ancients he was going to converse with. He would climb the stairs to his study. He would put one of his babies in a cradle and rock the cradle with one foot. He had 17 children, and he had to help Madame Casaubon out. But apart from that, he would read 5 and 6 hours at a time, hundreds of pages of Latin and Greek. Now, this was a dangerous routine. This is Casaubon's bladder. Casaubon died quite young, and the great physician Turquet de Mayerne, who did his autopsy, decided that Casaubon had died because he was such a passionate reader that he refused to interrupt himself to go to the bathroom, and did this to his bladder. So in 1709, when Casaubon's letters were published, the edition included a portrait of his bladder as the most palpable visual sign you could give of his extraordinary love of learning. Yet, as I reflect on Casaubon, it's clear to me that he was not a book bum in the sense that I am. Books in his time were the cutting edge of knowledge, and he read them, as others did, with cutting edge equipment. The point of reading for someone like Casaubon was that books offered the most powerful information you could have on everything from the anatomy of the human body to the frame of the physical universe to the other cultures, past and present, that interested him most. That's why readers in this period used magnificent equipment like Ramelli's book wheel, which enabled them to collate many books reading them against one another at the same time. And recently, in a research project that I carried out with a friend, I examined Casaubon as a reader and discovered that reading really was an adventure for him. Reading took him into areas of knowledge that had been pretty much closed to Christians in the past. One was the whole world of the Jewish religion and the Jewish people after biblical times. Of course, all Christians knew their Bible. But after biblical times, Jews and Christians, as we know, separated. No one had ever realized that Casaubon was a passionate student of the Jews. The book on your left is a medieval Hebrew grammar, the Book of Completion. And it turned up in the British Library in the 19th century with the signature Isaac Casaubonus on the bottom of the page. And the Hebrew bibliographer said, "Oh, this must be a rabbi I haven't heard of, Rabbi Yitzhak Casaubon." But in fact, there was no Rabbi Yitzhak Casaubon. It was Isaac Casaubon, the French Protestant, who mastered Hebrew grammar, read the Hebrew Bible book by book. That's his copy of Hosea and the other minor prophets, which he read text by text, line by line, word by word. He bought and read dozens of Hebrew books, and my collaborator and I reassembled his Hebrew library by the brilliant technical expedient of ordering every book in Hebrew printed before his death in 1614 in the British Library. He was in London when he died, and looking at them. And it turned out that he had a remarkable Hebrew collection, and it turned out that he had read really difficult books. This is a prayer book, and prayer book Hebrew is extremely hard. Many Jews never understood the prayer book, but just recited it. And here you can see him on the left translating prayer book Hebrew into Greek. That's what he did when he was learning a new language. But even better, on the bottom of the page, you see him translating and wondering about one of the prayers that an Orthodox Jew says every day. An Orthodox male Jew will thank God for not making him a woman. And Casaubon, a reformed, a passionate husband of patriarchal kind and a passionate reformed believer, puzzles at this. Why would you praise God for such a thing? On the other hand, earlier in the book, when he reads the penitential poems, the penitential prayers that Jews say on the Day of Repentance, his Calvinist heart is really warmed. This is a beautiful confession, he writes in the margin. So here you have a 16th century scholar adventuring, looking into the religious beliefs and ways of Jews, something that very few Christians had done at this point or would do for centuries after. He learned from a young Jew that he met in Oxford to read the Talmud, the great heart of Jewish tradition, this incredibly complex, layered text in which you move within the text and between the text and its commentaries. And we actually found the notes he took on the lessons he received from his Jewish friend. He even prayed in Hebrew from time to time. Shavach le'el borei olam, he says, praise be to God, creator of the universe. He misspells creator, but you can't have everything. So what I realized thinking about Casaubon was that reading for him was much more like what my students are doing with their PDFs than like what I do with books. It was the most advanced kind of research you could do. That's why King James hired him. King James, in addition to being the patron of the greatest piece of committee writing ever done before the Declaration of Independence, the King James Bible, was himself deeply educated in languages and in the classics and in the Bible, and he hired Casaubon to have lunch with him. Casaubon came to lunch with the king. That meant the king sat alone and ate and you stood behind him. And the king would ask him questions about renderings of passages in the Bible or the fathers of the church. This was the hottest learning there was at a time when the translation of the Bible was a great royal project. So when I think about the way our kind of learning is being transformed now, I try to think of Casaubon. When I saw in the 1990s and the aughties the first of my students who became obsessed with programming, coming to class, their faces pale from not having been outside in 48 hours, wearing rumpled pajamas and smelling slightly, I realized this was the kind of adventure Casaubon had made. So I try, when I think about books, to think about them in my period as a parallel to the digital world that we're having now. And it's that parallel that I want to work tonight, to think a little bit about the way the printed book transformed the worlds of thought and action in the 15th and 16th centuries, and to use that to think a little bit about how our world is being transformed for good but also for ill by the digital media that we know. This is the best that a historian can do. I spend a lot more time in the 16th century than I do in the present, and so it's only natural for me to try to use what I know something about to understand the world around me, which completely bewilders me. The beginning of wisdom in understanding the printing revolution is that it was not anything like a uniform transformation. The aesthetic of the book took a long, long time to shift. For more than half a century after print, the first thing a buyer of a printed book like this history did was to hire an illuminator to put pretty designs on the front page and a beautiful initial and put his arms in, transforming the printed book uniform, like all the other copies in an edition, into a unique, precious object like a manuscript. To look at two of the great moderns of the late 16th and early 17th century, the astronomers Tycho Brahe and Galileo Galilei, is to see the different sensibilities that could persist deep into the age of print. Both Tycho and Galileo made extraordinary astronomical discoveries by observation. Both of them brilliantly used print to advertise and to win converts to their discoveries. But Tycho produced magnificent, luxurious descriptions of his astronomical instruments and his finds, often colored for gift to particular patrons, something he could have done almost as well with scribes and illuminators as with his own printing press. Galileo, by contrast, when he wanted to tell the world that he had seen moons of Jupiter and irregularities in the face of the moon, Galileo used the form of the news pamphlet, the kind of book that announced battles and disasters and plagues all over Europe, and adapted it for the first time ever to the needs of science using these beautiful illustrations. You see his illustrations of the lunar surface at the bottom, very much more typographical in their sensibility than Tycho's to make his point. So uniformity is not to be had. And uniform modernity or post-modernity is not to be had either. We all know the basic form of the website, particularly the text-bearing website like Salon. You have ribbons of text down which you scroll, and next to them, the advertisements that are the only thing that make it possible to monetize a website like Salon. The brilliance of the color and the elaboration of the layout depend on being done digitally. But the basic idea actually came into existence not in the present Gilded Age, but in the last Gilded Age around 1900, when the editors of American magazines realized that rather than selling a few copies of a magazine for a great deal of money, they could sell a lot of copies very cheaply for less than their costs if they could find enough advertising to recoup and make a profit, and devised the form of the ribbon of text flanked or surrounded by advertising, which has been the basic form of the American magazine for more than a century. Websites have transposed this onto the web rather than fundamentally redoing it. And I think this is one of the many areas where the aesthetic of the web, just as the aesthetic of printing often reproduced that of manuscripts, the aesthetic of the web still reproduces that of print. And it'll be another 50 or 100 years and a few more iterations of the World Wide Web before we have a fully new aesthetic for presenting texts, not to mention a fully new way of monetizing them. One thing that printing did was speed things up. It's easy to contrast the scribe, the careful artisan, carefully inscribing letter by letter on his beautifully smoothed parchment, against the printer's workman who could produce every day first 100, then 500, and then as a standard by the end of the 15th century, as many as 1,000 sheets for an edition, so that in a matter of 2 or 3 months you could produce not a handful of copies, but 1,000 of them. This speed is what the first observers noted. Leon Battista Alberti, author of the first great treatise on painting of the Renaissance, was also the author of the first great treatise on ciphers, and in it he describes cipher wheels, basically the same as the Germans used in World War II for the Enigma code. Now, cipher wheels are a way of taking text and mechanically transposing it, and that seems to have been what inspired him to talk about printing. Printing had just come to Rome, and he talks in a dialogue at the beginning of his text with a friend called Leonardo Dati, a fellow Roman, about these new German printers who can produce, 3 men can produce 100 books in a month. It's extraordinary. Well, Dati actually bought one of those books, a copy of Augustine's City of God. It's now in the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris, and that's his owner's inscription on the bottom. So this is a real conversation that took place in the 1470s. And what's so striking about it is that what interested them was not the beauty or the ugliness, not the novelty or the commonness of these books, but just the speed of production. They could see what this would mean. One thing it meant was that book prices would plummet. This is our earliest price list of Roman printed books taken by a German tourist, and it shows that prices came down by 60 or 70% from scribal prices to print in the first 2 to 3 years of printing in Rome. So books came within the purchasing power of scholars. Then as now, scholar didn't rhyme with dollar. But after print, scholars could afford books in a way that had never been possible before. The number of books exploded. Between the invention of printing in the middle of the 15th century and 1500, the period we call the incunabular period, when printing was in its cradle, more than 17,000 titles appeared by the best estimates of our bibliographers. If each of those was even printed in 100 copies, that meant more books than had been produced by all the monastic scribes and commercial stationers of the Middle Ages working together, orders of magnitude more books. And that was transformative enough in itself. The printing shop was also transformative. To make a manuscript took several crafts working in succession. The vellum, or later the paper, had to be made, the scribe had to write the text, the illuminator had to adorn it, the binder had to fix it. But to print, you needed to bring different kinds of people together in a single space. So on your left, you see a wood engraving of an early printer's shop, and you see something happening here that didn't normally happen in early modern Europe. On the far left, as you see it, you can see printers' workmen wearing blouses and breeches, actually working the printing press. Down in the front, you see a boy, he's an apprentice, wetting paper so it will hold ink. In the back, someone is lifting wet pages to dry on a wire rack at the top. One of the things you have to imagine in the early printing shop is that it would have been like Navy signaling with flags. There would have been pages flapping by the end of the day because all of those pages would be lifted up to hang and dry. In the foreground, you see the master printer wearing a magnificent robe and counting on his fingers. Like all publishers then and now, he lives like a Maharaja but doesn't have 2 pennies to rub together and is terrified of catastrophe. Coming through the door at the back of the room is a woman clutching a gigantic German mug of beer. The printers got a mug of beer each every time they finished pulling a sheet. Authors complained that this was not propitious for accuracy. But the most interesting people, I think, are the men arguing in the back on the right and the man in the rough who is actually working with a composing stick at a form, at one of the actual forms of type that will be used to print pages. The men in the back are the printer's correctors, the learned men who were responsible for preparing the manuscript before the compositor would set it into type, and then for correcting proofs before all the pages were pulled. These were educated men working in the midst of noise, dirt, ink, something that didn't happen in the early modern world. You can see the different social statuses laid out by the dress, the men in ruffs and proper collars, working in the same place as the ordinary workman. I especially like the man in the ruff who seems to be setting type. He could be a compositor who was really well paid and overdressed, but I like to think he was like my father. My father was a newspaper editor in New York in the 1930s and 1940s, and he often had to say, "Stop the presses!" and change an article for the front page of the New York Post, which was his paper. And he learned to read proof upside down and backwards on the type rather than to wait for proof to be pulled. And the printers would let him fool around with their typesetting machine once he knew enough about it. So I like to think that this man with the ruff is a corrector who is getting his hands really dirty with the technical part of typesetting. This was an interdisciplinary world, and a world that developed its own culture. On the right, you see proofreading signs. This is from the first manual for proofreaders, and any of you who has done proofreading will recognize that these are, for the most part, the signs that we still use to indicate deletion and leaving a space and so on. So the printing house is its own world. It develops its own, It develops its own terminology. It makes scholars literally get their hands dirty. This is a surviving proof sheet from the great printing house of Christopher Plantin in Antwerp. At the bottom, you see a note in Latin from the editor of this book, a great 8-volume Bible, to the chief corrector. They actually communicate in Latin, because one is Spanish and one is Dutch. That's their common language. And the sheet is covered with ink. Great scholars working amidst the dirt and the ink. This was a genuinely new world. And it was a world that gave new opportunities. Someone like Martin Luther became not just the prophet of a new religion, but an extraordinary media maven. Like Galileo and long before Galileo, he saw the potential of the news sheet and the pamphlet, as well as the treatise and the commentary, for talking about religion and theology in a language that could appeal to ordinary people. When he wanted to say that monasticism was a big fake, he didn't just have to argue theologically. He could take from the news sheets of the day this prodigious figure of a calf, monstrous calf born looking like a monk, and say, "See, this is a divine portent that shows us we thought they were holy monks and they were just cows underneath." This was the language of the news sheet, the language of the pamphlets that circulated in city squares and taverns where one literate person could read them aloud and point to the pictures while others gawked. Luther was a master of this world. If you want to know why Luther survived, where so many heretics, and he began as a heretic before he had his own church, had not, think about this. Between 1517, when Luther began writing his appeals for reformation, in 1521, when he's summoned before Charles V, more than 100 works of Luther's appeared in print. Think about that extraordinary megaphone. 50,000, 60,000, 70,000 books by Luther circulating, moving from city to city, being read, being copied, being reprinted. No one had ever had a megaphone like that before with which to challenge the power of the church, and Luther knew how to use it with extraordinary brilliance. So the battering ram of these new quantities of books had tremendous seismic effects. In the 15th century, a library was a closed system. It was a body of texts chained to tables, subject by subject. The assumption was that it wouldn't grow very much, that each subject was defined, that the canon of books that treated it was defined, and that the space actually mapped out all of learning. This is the early Vatican library in a wonderful fresco from Santo Spirito. You'll be relieved to know there was a rule against walking on the tables at the Vatican, since it would have certainly have been really bad for the books. They did lend books from the Vatican Library in this period, but you always had to take the chain with the book so you wouldn't forget that it belonged to the Vatican rather than you. And if you kept it too long, as people occasionally did, you might get a recall letter from the Pope. There are a few of those preserved in the Vatican Library. So that idea of the library as a fixed system of books, each a work of art and craft as well as a classic, is completely disrupted by the flood of print that comes in, that challenges these authorities and forces scholars to put the books on the wheel and start the wheel rotating and try to decide what's true, what's false, what's valuable, what's less valuable. So that's my very schematic understanding of the revolution that my people lived through in the 15th and 16th centuries. What about the revolution that we're living through right now? Well, it's partly a revolution of speed and quality. Texts have become available faster, in greater quantity, more cheaply than ever before. We live in a book world that people only a generation ago couldn't have imagined. Think of what a miracle it is to open up your browser, go to Amazon, order a book, and know that it will be in your doorstep in 2 days with, if you're me, no charge for shipping because you're so gullible you're doing this all the time and they no longer charge you for shipping. Think what it means that you can open your Kindle or your Nook and in less than a minute download a book, usually costing less than the book would cost to order in material form for Amazon, and have it on your Kindle. This has made books available to us in ways that no previous generation could even have imagined. Digital technology has not just made books quicker to obtain, it's also transformed the economics of producing them. One point that's often missed by people who see what's happening now as the destruction of dead tree media, as they often say, by digital media, is that computer-assisted public printing makes it possible to print even short runs of books much more cheaply than was possible even 5 or 10 years ago. The computer is actually sustaining the production of material books as well as the production of digital books. And that's something which I think has enormous consequences. All of these books are surrounded by information in a way that was never true before. We don't have book reviews in the quantity that we used to in the newspapers that we also don't have in the quantities that we used to. But if you want to find out about a book before you buy it, there is Amazon with its sample look inside and its readers' reviews, all of them done by lunatics, but still it's readers' reviews. Well, that's only the people who review my books. There are the book sites like my personal favorite, bookslut.com, with their extraordinary long and detailed descriptions of books and interviews with authors. There are Google Books, which also offers you the possibility to look inside a bigger and bigger percentage of the books that's published. The numbers of books that we're producing are staggering. In 2002, in America, we produced 215,000 traditional books and 247,000 non-traditional ones, e-books and others. In 2009, we produced 288,000 traditional books and 764,000 non-traditional books. These are digital books that are identified, they have ISBNs, they can be ordered. This is astonishing, more than 1 million titles in a year. And if you add to this the number of open access media, self-publishing systems, web pages, social media, and blogs in which people can publish, you see that printing, which gave scholars and theologians a new kind of voice in the 16th century, has given pretty much everybody a new kind of voice in the 21st. The effect of this can be revolutionary and is nowhere more revolutionary than in the sciences, which of course have almost entirely moved away from the book. Only mathematicians still produce and consume traditional books in any numbers. My friends in astrophysics at Princeton tell me that 2 generations ago they went to the library. A generation ago they went to their coffee room where they would heap up Xeroxed preprints of the articles from the people they were networked with. And now they boot up the archive system based at Cornell and see what new astrophysical articles have been posted since they looked last the day before. And they also tell me that this has had a tremendous democratizing effect, and that observatories and universities that weren't part of the main networks 20 or 30 years ago have established themselves by the quality of their work as being full participants in the discourse. So this is a tremendous transformation which has affected every field of knowledge, and I'm sure that everyone here, in addition to using, as for those of us who are humanists, our traditional means of finding information, accessing texts, and studying, uses dozens of digital media in the course of a single day. This is absolutely transformative. Even in the world of the book bum, it's transformative. I spend most summers in the British Library reading rare books, and of course even the British Library doesn't have everything, which makes it all the more wonderful that the Bayerische Staatsbibliothek in Munich has digitized more than 500,000 books very beautifully and lets you download them freely for nothing, until 2 in the afternoon when the Wi-Fi cuts out at the British Library for reasons that I'm not absolutely clear about. So this is a transformation in access to audiences, a transformation in access to information of a sort that is so great that it could not even have been imagined, I think, 20, 30 years ago. Now, one of my favorite Renaissance print professionals was Desiderius Erasmus, warm humanist, author of The Praise of Folly, subject of Durer's Great Prophet. A portrait on the right, you see him writing a blurb. He was a print professional, and so when an edition of Seneca was published in Basel, he produced a blurb in the third person, which says, "Reader, here you have all the works of Lucius Annaeus Seneca, plus some other ones." You can see he was up late that night because you have all the works plus some other ones. It's not highly logical. With all of their errors pruned away by the editorial care of Erasmus, or at least most of them. If you read these works carefully, he tells you, they will polish your character as Erasmus has polished the texts. Is that a good blurb or what? It's not surprising that this edition sold out well before the other ones that rivaled it. So Erasmus actually lived in the shop of Johannes Froben, the printer who produced this and other editions, for much of his life. So he's a print professional, somebody who cast his lot, not with the courts where he could have had a job as a counselor and a very large salary and an important social role, but with printing shops in independent cities like Basel and Freiburg, where he could speak to a Europe-wide audience and maintain his freedom and autonomy as a writer. Yet even Erasmus worried, as he tells us. He worried that print would make it possible to put bad things into the market. Imagine that. What a cynic. Yet even Erasmus could not have imagined the devil, whose name is David Pascoe. David Pascoe is a business professor in France who has created a company called Icon Group, Reference Publications for the 21st Century. He employs a staff of programmers, and he has a large number of computers. Using algorithms that he wrote, the computers and programmers use information freely available on Google and other public sites to create books. 770,000 books. So some of those non-traditional books available on Amazon are the books created by David Pascoe. They're not thrilling. This is not Jane Austen, with or without zombies. This is the 2007 to 12 outlook for rubber floor mats, matting, and stair treads. And this is the book for the United States. There's also one for China. You'll notice that it costs $495. Now, you all know the old joke, the food's untouched by human hands, the chef is a gorilla. In this case, you have books which have been untouched by human hands in manufacture, which are entirely put together by algorithms, and they're put together as a bet. Pascoe bets that if he puts together enough of these, he's not going to, it's not like the monkeys that will eventually write Shakespeare. It is the Pascoe who will eventually find suckers. If he produces enough books on floor mats, which cost him essentially nothing to produce, eventually someone will pay $495 for one copy, and his costs will be paid back. He's actually made a considerable amount of money and gone public. So the digital revolution has unleashed horrors that Erasmus couldn't have conceived of. The digital revolution also has done something akin in the world of the book to what it's done much more thoroughly in the world of music. As texts float free, as they circulate more and more easily without being paid for, as, don't tell anybody, but in our library there are big scanners, and a lot of our students seem to spend most of their time scanning books completely illegally and sending them to their accounts. As texts float free, as music floated free in the last generation, it's becoming harder and harder to make money publishing books. You can make money with a book that gets a lot of attention. Chad Harbach's The Art of Fielding, which I heartily recommend, a charming baseball book about a Midwestern liberal arts college. That seems to be making money. But many kinds of book that once could be floated in the old publishing regime, where one book published by a learned or a high standard press would finance a few others that brought in more money, can't be done very well anymore. And I'll just give you two instances. One is translation. America used to be a great country of translators. Our greatest publishers, Alfred Knopf and his rivals, looked every year in Europe and Asia for books that they could translate for the American public. I have an 800-page German novel by a novelist whose name I've completely forgotten at home in the Knopf translation. And on the dust jacket, there's a letter from Knopf saying, "When I read this 800-page German novel in Frankfurt, I couldn't rest till I had brought it to the American public." Well, Knopf could do that because many of his books threw off very large profits, which subsidized a book like this, which was costly and threw off less profit. But as profits go down, except for a very few bestsellers, that 1 for Caesar and 3 for God method of the old publishers is harder and harder to apply. Anybody know what percentage of the books published in America are translations now? Anybody want to venture a guess? 3%. 3% of the books we publish in every field, from literature to scholarship, are translated from all the languages of the world. We are at the center of an empire and we're blind. And of course, we're not very good at foreign languages ourselves. One thing we have in common with the ancient Greeks is that, like them, instead of learning foreign languages, we speak our own language louder when abroad and hope to be understood. So translation was never easy, but it was much more common a generation ago than it is now. And one terrible consequence of the rise of the web may be that it will become as good as impossible to translate anyone who is not a famous author into English. A second, and to me even more worrying area, is the scholarly book, the learned book, the monograph, its gray pages, half footnotes, the book which discovers something new, which teaches us that a strange man in the Friuli who thought the world was a cheese and people developed in it like worms turns out to be a window into a whole forgotten world of peasant custom. Those books have always been produced by nonprofit publishers, and there's a reason. Books like that are never going to make money. When I handed in my own first book to my editor at Oxford University Press, she smiled and said, "Yes, Mr. Grafton, they don't call Oxford the home of lost causes for nothing." But still, Some learned books used to sell. Robert Palmer's 12 Who Ruled, a great narrative history of the French Revolution, sold 90,000 copies for Princeton University Press in the 1950s and subsidized a range of other books for years. Johns Hopkins Press floated its list for 10 years on the profits earned by publishing the first handbook on how to treat adult incontinence. A book which sold more than 100,000 copies. But as books like that are more and more grabbed off by commercial publishers, as science moves more and more into the web and such handbooks are more and more digitized, the possibility of doing this is becoming more and more evanescent. Scholarly books, which appeared in editions of 1,000 when I was a student, now appear in editions of 100 or 50. And the rest of the copies are printed on demand. That's why they cost $135, and it's hard not to see that as a death spiral. What will come next? 40 copies at $250? 30 copies at $380? There's a point at which the whole system simply falls apart under its own weight. And it's not clear at all how a system which is very difficult to monetize can provide the safeguards, the refereeing, the copy editing that made scholarly books reliable. Systems of distribution are also being transformed. In the 1990s, we had the magnificent rise of enormous bookstores popping up like toadstools across the American landscape. Suddenly, every big shopping center had a Borders or a Barnes & Noble with handsome faux wood shelves, a stock of 100,000 books in places where there had never been anything comparable, often an eager expert staff recommending particular books, readings by authors, gatherings of reading groups. The bookshops became, as some social thinkers say, a third place, not home, not work, but a place for assembly in the absence of alcohol, but in the presence of books and espresso. What could possibly be better? Well, it lasted for a generation, but Borders is gone. Barnes & Noble seems to be struggling very hard not to follow in their path. And it's not just the retail that seems to me to be missing. This was a big social and cultural feature of the American landscape, a tremendous addition to it, and it's going to disappear unless I'm very, very mistaken. Libraries are being transformed as well. And the transformation of the library seems to me a more complex and likely to be a more intricate affair. This is an example of the new public library, the Salt Lake City Public Library, gleaming, sun-filled, magnificent, its air scented with the smell of croissants and freshly brewed coffee, its pavement ringing with the sound of skaters dropping their boards as they come into the building to look at the zine store. It's a wonderful place. It has everything but books. What it does have, however, is good Wi-Fi and a great many computers, which you can use for free if you rent them. This, it seems to me, is what the library is becoming more and more, the public library and even the college and university library, a digital commons. This has wonderful qualities. For the 20% of the American population which does not have access at home to the World Wide Web or to digital media, the library is a place where you can fill out forms, where you can get help filling out forms, where you can find an English speaker to help you filling out forms. This is a magnificent thing. This is a way in which libraries are fulfilling their American promise in a way more powerfully than they perhaps did before for older as well as younger generations. But in colleges and universities, this model, and in research libraries, this model terrifies me. Over and over, I meet university presidents, university trustees, library directors who think there is no point keeping books in libraries anymore, that this is the model that all libraries should follow. And I'm here to tell you that that's a problem. In the first place, as I've already said, we're producing more books, more material texts than ever. The system may be fragile, but it is productive. They may be dead tree media, but if you're the librarian of Princeton University, you feel like Macbeth seeing Birnam Wood come to Dunsinane every year, because that dead wood marches in 5 miles of books a year. I can't even imagine how many miles of books you buy at Harvard. Many of them, of course, not digitally available, especially books that come from the Southern Hemisphere, books that come from South Asia, books that come from the Middle East. Many of these books exist only in analog form. Libraries are not sufficiently aware of their own book treasures and of the way that research for the next generation, just like the aesthetic of the next generation of books and sites, has to be mixed, has to be a matter of going back and forth from one medium to another. Let me tell you a horror story. The New York Public Library, they threw me out in the 1960s. Now they're throwing the books out. In the next 5 years, the New York Public Library will remove the stacks that are inside the main building and the 3 million books that they hold. Only a small number of rare books and manuscripts and the books that are under Bryant Park will remain at the New York site. The rest will all be outhoused in Princeton, New Jersey, in a site that the New York Public Library shares with my university in Columbia. The theory is that you'll be able to get any book in a day if you order it in advance, but I'm here to tell you that they don't even come from across Route 1 to Princeton's library in a day. They're not going to get to New York in a day. More serious is the attitude that this reveals. The New York Public Library has some of America's greatest collections, for example, of books in Slavic languages. But if you don't think books are important anymore, you see no need to have experts to sort them, catalog them, and make them available. So the New York Public Library has no Slavic librarian anymore. They've given the title to the curator of Judaica, who thus has 2 full-time jobs as well as no staff. The New York Public Library has great older collections of books in Arabic, and there is no one on the staff any longer who reads the Arabic language, because of course books don't matter, they can be outhoused. At this point, it seems to me the digital revolution's propaganda has far outrun its reality. This is a point at which one is actually sacrificing basic treasures for an unjustified belief that somehow everything is going to be on the web. Stanford made plans to take their East Asian library at a time when East Asia has never been more important to America and outhouse the entire thing, 500,000 books. When faculty protested, they were told by Stanford's president, they're all on Google Books. Many tens of thousands of these books are in languages that have not yet been digitized. There's no way to do OCR on them, much less are they available. So this for me is a terrifying feature of the moment. It's true, the digital library will be comprehensive. Erasmus worried that books could be lost. After all, the ancient library of Alexandria, the greatest in the world, had disappeared. And one of the things that made him happy when he settled in 1508 with Aldus Manutius, the great printer in Venice, was that Aldus was systematically taking the classics in Greek and in Latin and in Italian and printing them in editions of hundreds of copies. Aldus, said Erasmus, is producing a library without walls. Other libraries were selfish places only open to a few users. This library is open to everyone. And he himself produced a kind of library in a single book, the Adages, this great collection of classical sayings which became the basis of classical culture in Europe, mistakes and all, for the next several centuries. If you've ever used the phrase Pandora's box, you're repeating a mistake that Erasmus made writing this very quickly in Aldus's printing house. Pandora opened a jar, not a box, but Erasmus worked quickly and he didn't have time to check. So in English and French and German, it's Pandora's box. Not in Italian, Erasmus was censored, it's Il Vaso. But this extraordinarily successful book was, in a way, Erasmus's model of a library without walls, a book that made the classics available to a young schoolboy in Stratford-on-Avon named William Shakespeare, who read it very carefully and wove it into the fabric of his plays. Well, it's easy for us to see in retrospect that Aldus's library without walls wasn't universal. It was limited to a few languages, it was limited to canonical texts, it was very expensive, so it was only for gentlemen and ladies who could afford to buy it. Google's universal library is very different. It started only 10 years ago, And with the new scanning techniques they've invented, the multiple partners they've found, it is moving rapidly to become the largest library in the world. You use through Google's simple, rapidly downloadable search box. When my wife and I visited our daughter, a Peace Corps volunteer in Benin, and my graduate students sent me questions, as graduate students always will, which I had to answer on an IBM 486 in an unair-conditioned internet cafe in Natatangu, I was able to do it thanks to Google Books. But it's also a very problematic achievement. Great libraries in the past have been built by librarians who were conscious and making choices, and took smaller collections and put them together in mosaics and developed policies. Google is put together like a gigantic vacuum cleaner. What's in the stacks is what they duplicate. So my wonderful friend and colleague Robert Darnton used to praise Google by saying, anyone can go to Google and read George Eliot's Middlemarch in its original parts. So I looked it up, and indeed, that appeared to be true, that you could read Middlemarch in the original parts, which would otherwise only be in a rare book room. But then I called it up and discovered that Google Books has actually given us only parts 1 and 2 and 5 and 6. Part 3 and 4, part 7 and 8 have not yet been digitized in Google Books. So you can read half of Middlemarch, but not continuously. And Google Books, as everyone here knows who uses it regularly, is honeycombed like that worm-eaten book I showed you at the beginning, with catastrophic errors, omissions, bad decisions of every kind, 20-volume books reproduced as a single PDF, which is absolutely impossible to use, German books of the 18th century subjected to OCR, which rendered their long S's as F's, so that the German word Wissenschaft for science appears as Wissenschaft throughout. I once searched and found something like 12,000 cases of Wissenschaft on Google Books. That's a lot of Wissenschaft. More to the point, it's a very fragile creation. Electronic books are nobody's property, except the company that has put them up. They can be withdrawn at any time, as of course owners of an edition of 1984 of all books found, when Amazon withdrew them from the Kindles in which they had been deposited and paid for, because they discovered a copyright violation. When you have a digital book from Amazon or Google, it's a very fragile thing. In one sense, of course, they're not fragile. Amazon and Google and the other digitizing institutions have so many servers, and they refresh them so frequently, that these texts are safer as long as they're maintained than any physical library could be. They're multiply backed up. But that will go on only as long as Google and Amazon see the possibility of making a profit. Microsoft dipped a toe into book digitization, made agreements with the British Library and other serious players, and then decided that Google was too far ahead and withdrew, ending those programs and causing tremendous disturbance. Google, as you all know, is finding it very difficult to find a solution to what to do about books that are still in copyright, but whose authors don't want them to be made digitally available on the web. Even more worrying, Google is now trying to monetize Google Books in all sorts of ways. The interface has changed, and they're more interested in selling you things now than they were in earlier years. And if that doesn't work, one day we'll wake up to an announcement that Google has decided that Google Books was a great idea, but just not profitable enough to be carried on. So even this library is a fragile library. And of course, it's also anything but a universal library. It's a library skewed to English. It's a library skewed to the books that happen to be in Google's partners. So that dream of a universal library remains a dream even now. We can dream it a little more plausibly, but it's still a dream. Let me finish with what my people in the 16th century might have called the 64 ducat question. What does it mean that reading is migrating to the digital world? And that is surely happening. In 10 or 20 years, most of our contact with text will be digital. And in 50 years, it could well be that all of it will be digital. Well, On the one hand, it means that vast numbers of things will be available to us. But what does it mean that they're available? The cognitive scientists who work on reading tell us that we read on the web in a different way than we read printed texts. This is the F shape, which is what your eyes follow when you read a screen. Whether you're conscious of it or not, when a normal person reads a screen, he or she sweeps from left to right, goes back to the left, goes down a bit, sweeps not quite as far to the right, goes back, and keeps going forward. You don't cover the whole screen the way you presumably cover a whole page. And of course, the lengths of lines on printed pages are set by the length of the saccades of the human eye. This is ancient knowledge. It goes back to scribes in Greece doing papyrus rolls. That's why a page can't be infinitely wide. We don't read these the way we read pages. We read them quickly. We read them for information rather than for their full content. And that explains why web pages are laid out as they are, with the important information in bars across the top and along the left. When you open up your slate every morning, as I do, it's not an accident that Doonesbury is on the right, because it doesn't matter if you read Doonesbury or not. That's not what they're trying to sell you. That is, as it happens, why I open Slate. I never read anything else there. So I suppose I'm foiling them. So what does it mean that we will be reading texts with this F pattern? More worrying for those, and some of you will have read Nicholas Carr's terrifying book, The Shadows, which goes into this in some detail. You don't read the screen with the same part of your brain with which you read books. When you read printed text, you read with a part of your brain that's directly linked to your long-term memory. That's why you remember what you read when you read it in a book. When you read on a screen, you're actually reading with your prefrontal cortex, which is usually the part of your brain that you use not for reading and remembering, but for solving problems. It's the part of your brain that says, shall I go to that link? That looks like fun. I think I'll go there. And then shall I go to that link? And then shall I go to this link? And where was I starting? It's the problem-solving part of your brain. It's not tightly linked to long-term memory at all. And that explains why what you read on a screen so often seems evanescent, seems to go away. You're literally not able to deposit it in long-term memory, or so it's thought, in the way that you can deposit what you read in a book. So what does it mean that we're transferring reading from one kind of activity to another? Here, I really have to leave you with a question. I believe in these discoveries of the cognitive theorists. They've done very interesting work tracking eye motions very carefully. I believe in the inquiries which tell us that the average person looking up a website spends between 20 and 25 seconds there. The inquiry into London University students that discovered that even though their colleges had libraries with very powerful specific search engines, more than 95% of them began all of their searches at Google or Yahoo outside the college server rather than going to the library. And that even if they went into the library and looked up an ebook, the average time spent was 4 minutes. What does all of this mean? I don't think we know. And I have two radically different suggestions to offer as I close. One is that reading indeed is going to be transformed into something very different. This is what publishers seem to believe. The publisher of a book, any serious book, invited you to make an effort of imagination and collaboration, to read the book and picture for yourself what the book called up in words, to imagine the characters of a novel, to follow the writer through the anfractuosities of her plot rather than to make your own, to cast yourself on the mercy and generosity of the writer. More and more, the publishers who are producing books in electronic form see books as very different, much more malleable, want to offer you not just novels, but novels with video. Not just novels with video, but novels with multiple endings among which you can choose. Not just novels with multiple endings, but novels with characters to whom you can send emails and who will answer you. I don't think it's really the novel characters who do this. The idea is clearly that just as we're told by educational reformers that the lecture is dead and nobody can listen to someone talking for an hour, so we should give up the lecture entirely, so the book is dead. No one will cast themselves any longer on that great ocean of print and swim there for days or weeks or months. The experience of reading has to be varied, made entertaining, softened, multiplied into many different arts. But there's another possibility as well. We're very adaptable monkeys. We're extremely good at learning to do things in different ways. And if you think about the history of books over the centuries, it seems clear to me that we've been very good at learning how to use very different kinds of book in some of the same ways. When Virgil read Homer, when the great Roman poet read the great Greek poet, 8 centuries older than he, what he read was a pile of scrolls. Each book of Homer filled a scroll. The Iliad was 24 scrolls long, the Odyssey was 24 scrolls long, and you only had 2 ways to read them. You either held it in your lap and rolled it out and read it, or you listened as a reader, often a skilled reading slave, read it aloud to you. Both of these ways of reading seem to me intolerably awkward, slow, time-consuming, but no one has ever known Homer better than Virgil did. The Aeneid, its first half a reworking in response to the Odyssey, its second half a reworking in response to the Iliad, shows that a great reader and writer could read that pile of scrolls and somehow see the book behind them as a whole. 4 centuries later, St. Augustine read Virgil. And Augustine read Virgil in a codex, maybe an illustrated codex of the hideous kind they like to make in the 4th century. That's a 4th century Roman manuscript of Virgil with a classics comics illustration. And this is what Roman aristocrats like to read. And Augustine, reading Virgil in a codex, knew Virgil as well as Virgil knew Homer. Knew Virgil well enough that he flagellated himself once he'd converted to Christianity because he had cried when Dido died in the Aeneid. How could he have cried over a pagan? But more important, well enough that he could write the story of his own life as an epic like the Epic of Aeneas, a Christian version of a pagan epic. And then Dante read Virgil in a different form and found the profound story of a Roman who was almost a Christian. And in the late 20th century, Derek Walcott read Homer in a paperback translation, which he claims he never finished, and wrote a magnificent epic of the Caribbean, Omeros, out of it. And Jonathan Shays, a psychologist, read the Iliad in a paperback translation and found in it the inspiration for a radical new way to treat the veterans of the Vietnam War, the first successful way that any psychologist has found. Somehow, the books survive their formal metamorphosis. Somehow, we find ways of having a relationship with books in so many different forms. So I think I'm going to keep my own preference for the material book, the book that, like me, grows older and shows its nicks and marks and shows the signs of age. But I'm going to nourish a hope that the digital book, like the codex book, like the file of scrolls, like the book read aloud in antiquity, will continue to prove an inspiration and an obsession, and to generate what will still recognizably be book bums, even if they don't have grubby secondhand stores to hang around in anymore. Thank you.